Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Fernanda Dantes. I'm International Affairs Manager at the Brazilian Book Chamber and APEX that foster in exports and investments, and the Brazilian Agency for Promoting Exports and Investments, APEX Brazil. On behalf of Brazilian Publish APEX CBL, I'd like to thank your attendance here today. This live all the agenda of Brazil at Frankfurt Book Fair. Is part of this partnership. We have a chat up to Saturday at 11 a.m. Using Brazilian time. And we have on Saturday a talk about children books. We have a live on Saturday about Brazilian indigenous literature. Our team is going to leave all the information in the comments if you want to know more information and about how to sign up. And we have a special playlist on Spotify so that you can follow your readings with songs, and the link will be shared here on the chat. On Saturday, on the 17th, we have a special agenda, Bookfest Online. It's the official fest here for Frankfurt Book Fair. Brazil will be present with three roundtables, two literary ones and one happy hours. We are going to have Paulo Scott, Socorro Azioli, and Emilio Fraia. We have our traditional happy hour, Caipirinha hour. It's going to be with Victor Tavares, the chairman of CBL, is going to make an opening for this moment to have fun. And you are going to learn how to make a traditional Brazilian drink, caipirinha, and learn about its history. All this agenda, this schedule will be on the chat. You can follow it. Today, our topic is a successful case. We are talking about Machado de Assis and his literature, and a wonderful, beautiful translation into English done by Flora Thomson-Deveaux that was an extreme success. To analyze this phenomenon, we count on an expert in Machado de Assis, Hélio de Seixas Guimarães. And now, with the floor, our moderator, José Almeida Júnior. He's a writer and public prosecutor in the Federal District. He's the author of The Man That Hated Machado de Assis and The Last Hour, Última Hora in Portuguese. It's an award-winning novel of the SESC Awards. So the question must be directed on Q&A channel. José, the floor is yours.
Obrigado, Fernanda. Primeiro,
Thank
queria
you,
agradecer
Fernanda. First, I'd like to thank
esse
CBL's
evento.
invitation to ask me to participate in this event. Thank you for everybody for attending it. It's a pleasure to be here with the two important characters for Machado de Assis studies. And Hélio de Seixas Guimarães is one of the greatest experts on Machado de Assis. I've read virtually everything he wrote, Machado de Assis, Machado de Assis, the writer that reads us, among other ones. He organized many texts with Ieda. And Flora is a person that is very important in Machado de Assis studies. She studies the works of Machado de Assis in the US. She's a translator, and I'll make the formal introduction according to the script, and I'll give the floor to you so that you can talk about yourselves, introduce yourselves, and tell us about this relationship with Machado de Assis, your studies on his works. First, Flora. She translated from Spanish and Portuguese. She has been doing it since 2009. She has a degree in languages and Portuguese and Spanish culture. She has a degree in Latin America studies in Princeton. She is a PhD in Portuguese and Brazilian Studies by Brown University, and she's the research director from Rádio Novelo from Rio de Janeiro. I've been listening to these podcasts The first thing I do every morning, I
Conheço
I
essa Flora,
heard
e
an
foi lá do seu
accent and
quiz.
I thought, oh, I think I know this Flora, and then I
Estava
recognized you. I realized that you were the research director. Hello, Hélio de Seixas Guimarães, a professor and researcher at
pronto, estudos.
the University of São Paulo. He's
Pesquisador
editor of Machado de Assis in Line,
da biblioteca.
e-magazines of Machado de Assis studies, researcher at CNPq, and recently he organized 12 volumes, escritor por escritor, writer by writer, Machado de Assis, according his peers, and he puts together over 100 Brazilian writers regarding Machado de Assis. So I'd like you to introduce yourself, Flora, and to talk about your relation with Machado de Assis. You are North American, and Machado de Assis, how did it come about? Thank you. I didn't know how to talk about Machado de Assis' works here, but you made a reference there. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here having this talk with you and Hélio. So, as North American, I knew Machado de Assis. Well, I didn't know it in translation. I started studying Portuguese in my graduation. It was an accident. There, I didn't have any relation with the language, with Brazil. It was something that came about. I decided studying it, and then I started engaging with it and the Brazilian culture in this context. And to my mind, that I decided to do it. I was developing a closer relationship with Brazil. I was thinking about doing an exchange course here. And I thought, if I want to know Brazil, I must know Machado de Assis. Nobody told me that. It was an impression that I had of his works. He's a giant character in Brazilian literature, so it was something inevitable to me. It could be something boring, but I did my homework. I bought a cheap edition from Memórias, Póstumas e Brás, Cubas. The title caught my attention. It's a little bit strange, isn't it? And then in the first pages, I was completely absorbed by the book. When we think about the great literature of a country, I could see these features there. And sometimes it's a little bit boring or a little slow or something older, antique. And the lightness, the life in this text enchanted me. I was completely hooked by it. And Machado and this romance, this novel, follows me since I was 19. Flora, you talked about your first impression you had, and then came to my mind my first memories. I was 14 or 15. It's a mandatory reading for the students in Brazil, and I had the sensation of being enchanted by it. Hélio, I'd like you to talk a little bit about yourself, your trajectory, along with Machado de Assis. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank CBL the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here with José Almeida Júnior and Flora Thomson to talk about Machado de Assis. My relation with Machado de Assis started back then. My father had a library with several collections of Brazilian literature. At that time, he had Jackson, Graciliano, Jorge Amado. In the midst of the 70s, I started reading it there. I started reading Helena. I could have given up because Helena, it's not an easy novel to read. I liked this novel. It's a romantic romance, but I kept reading. And then I started reading it at school. In the high school, I had read Memórias, Posthumous 3 times when they asked me to read it. And I hadn't imagined that I would work with Machado de Assis and that I would have a career in literature and languages. And
na faculdade tive
at college, I had courses with amazing professor Roberto Schwartz, Alfredo Boss. I had a whole course about Machado de Assis and also Schwartz. He was talking about the capitalism related to Memórias, Póstumas de Brás, Cubas. When I got to the masters, I stepped back. I said, I'm not ready to work with this author. His book had just been released, Roberto Schwartz book. And then I stepped back, and my master's was about literary works adaptation. I worked with Helena, adaptation for TV. It was very important in the 70s, and it was adapted for TV. It was the most adapted Machado de Assis work adapted for TV series. I did my PhD, and then I had Machado de Assis again. That in the US, I went to the US to study melodrama, and then when I realized I was working with Machado, I did my PhD about the readers of Machado de Assis, the role of the readers in his works, because narrators they discuss, they argue in their work. It's something exacerbated, and then I went there to study how that come about, and the way that his works were received. Because somehow he made comments about the reading conditions in Brazil in his time. And then I did this thesis and I never left it. This thesis was defended in 2001. This turnaround started in 98. So every day I read something about Machado de Assis. I read about him. I write about him. It's something that I was engrossed in. I couldn't leave it anymore. And here I am 20 years later after the defense of my thesis, and I'm taken aback, surprised by Machado every day. And now there is a graduation course with Machado de Assis. To reread it is a pleasure. To teach Machado de Assis is wonderful, it's beautiful. The surprise of the students when they read Machado de Assis. It's a writer that it's hard to be indifferent to his text. That's what Flora said, that she was hooked by Machado's text. If you allow yourself, you really engage in it because it's light, it's heavy, it has a balance in Machado's text, which is impressive. It's something really rare, the elements he puts together. This is the story. And then I started studying it, how Machado had been read throughout the time, and then I left it with several texts, articles, books about this reception, how Machado was read by the writers. Okay, these two volumes that you mentioned, José Almeida, the writer by writer, the escritor por escritor. Yeah, over 100 writers talking about Machado de Assis. That's my trajectory. Machado de Assis is a case that not only his works is addicting, but also his writing. When I have some free times, I go to Google and I start reading text by Machado de Assis. There are wonderful things. Academic production on Machado de Assis' work is impressive, high quality work. Flora, I'd like you to tell us, what was the idea like? How did you come about this idea of translating it after getting to know Machado? How did this idea to translate him come about? Yeah, I want to make it clear that I wasn't an arrogant a girl when I was 19 years old and thought, oh, I'm going to translate it. I didn't think that because this is a text that takes you back. You are in the hands of the reader. You are a toy in the writer's hands. You don't think about this text and make it something yours. There is a huge leap there. So years and years so that I could make this decision. What happened was that I came to Brazil, I got to know Rio, and I got closer to the language, culture, literature. I finished my degree. I kept on studying, getting to know Machado's work, and getting to know other romances in depth, rereading Brás Cubas. And throughout this way, throughout this path, the book gained more and more layers. It's something kind of obvious, I may say, but this lightness that I think that impacts us in the first reading, all the games, the tricks, the surprises. And what stood out was this history, weight, brutality, cruelty of the romance. The book became heavier and heavier to me. And then I revisited it again in 2014 to translate a book from another great José Sergio Castro Rocha. It's a book that goes through Machado de Assis by emulation poetry. When I accepted to translate the books, I had been working as translator for some years, and then I said that's okay. I translate João César's text. All Machado's novels, they had a translation into English. And I thought, well, I go there to the library to get the published works. I won't have to translate Machado. So I had developed a reference. If I thought how much I would have to translate his books, but if I had to start from scratch, but it wasn't like that. The first thing I found out is that João César's situations were much more comprehensive than the works translated in English. He gets poetry, chronicles, side B works. And then I got into trouble. I had to translate our master. And what surprised me was when I was trying to enter these published translations that João César was doing, he was thinking about theological details related to the structure of the text. The translation didn't work. The existing translation, because the tone was different, the sentence format was changed, some details, subtle details, not an error, but it didn't fit in that approach. Then I saw myself obliged to retranslate it to make it make sense in English, these parts of the novels. So it was disturbing back then. The ideal is not to translate a paragraph at loose or three sentences of Brás Cubas. I had this idea as I am retranslating. The correct thing would be to translate the whole book to get some conclusions in order to know how to translate these three sentences. So this project process gave me this anguish feeling. And I learned that there was room for other readings, versions of Machado de Assis in English. This is what Hélio said, that you are getting to know Machado de Assis' works, and you see how many brilliant people have worked on it for a century or decades of production, and we get a little bit intimidated, feeling that not only the most brilliant things were made, everything was said. Every week you put Machado de Assis on Google, and you see more things. yeah, you can spend the whole day there and you can observe many good people working on it. I had this idea for translation. I had three translations. I had three translations of Machado de Assis from the 50s, the 90s, the last one made by Gregory Robassington, a famous translator. We understand that the translation is something creative. There isn't a definite translation. And this project of João Salles showed me the opposite, that there were gaps, there were new things to be said, new readings of Machado de Assis that could show up in the translations of his work. I finished the translation of his book. I was getting to PhD at Brown University. Since the beginning, I thought the PhD as the ideal place to have a literary work, a heavy one, because translator, we race against the times, the deadlines from the publishers, and so on. They must grab it out of our hands because we want to keep on making adjustments. I thought the PhD time during my course to marinate the works and start thinking about the publishing part when I felt that it was ready. So I dedicated the years of my PhD to translation, but in a plain way, all the preparatory research to get to know the theory of translation, to make all the parallel research, do my translation, and study the other translations to understand them as reading as workmates, not rivals of my translation, to see what other eyes saw in the book that I didn't. And after all, this translation was one of the chapter of my thesis, and now it was released in June. So this is the whole story. So I will ask everyone about this publishing work, how Penguin got to you, how did you get to Penguin, and Hélio, did you, a great part of your studies of Machado was the reception of Machado de Assis, how he was received by others, and Machado de Assis written by writers. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about this internationalization of Machado de Assis' work, how did it work? It's a process that it's ongoing. The translation, the recent translation of Flora shows that it's a process full of unfolding, but it's a late process in my opinion. In life, Machado de Assis, he wanted to be translated. He tried to be translated into German. He had 3 attempts, but he didn't make it happen. He had a vision that his work could have wider reach to go beyond Brazil borders, but he had only 2 books translated: the posthumous memoir of Brás Cubas that was released in 92 from Uruguay, and then in 1905 in Argentina. So he circulated very little out of Brazil, some poems, but he was very little translated. After his death in 1908, we started having translations into French, Italian, and some translations into German of some textbooks, but it was a very sparse translation, very little systematic, that started unfolding throughout the time, a title here, another title there. The great leap in Machado de Assis' reading starts in the early 50s, when there is the first translation of
são
Machado's book
Memórias Póstumas,
into English,
né?
which is the posthumous memoir of Brás
Grossman,
Cubas.
exato.
It was translated
Grossman
by
para,
William Grossman
para o inglês, né?
into English.
Publicada no Brasil em
It
51.
is published
Você mais
in
pare-
Brazil
curiosa.
in 51. He was an engineer. He
Campos.
was one of the founders of ITA in São José dos Campos. He fell in love with the Portuguese language, Machado de Assis, and after he became a translator of Jorge Amado and other Machado de Assis texts. He made this translation in Portuguese. He published it here. The posthumous memoir of Brás Cubas. And the following year, in 52, he published it in the US, a new epitaph of a small winner was released in the US in 52. From that, in the following years, there was 52, the posthumous memoir of Brás Cubas, 53, Dons Camus, and then more works after that. So there we noticed a possibility of this writer that had never been translated. He had only 3 tales translated, and we had 3 books in a row. This represents a great opportunity, the translation into English, the great language. It becomes an international language. From these translation into English, Machado starts not only to be translated systematically, and today we have all the novels of Machado de Assis. All the tales are translated into English, some of them in several versions. Brás Cubas has 5 different translations. A writer that has 5 point of views, different translators. All the translations, they have their own interests. They're different. We started having a reception of these translations because it generates studies about the author, the writer. In the US, Machado de Assis has an importance in their reading as well, and they gave important inputs. And then it started from English, and it was translated into Danish, Sweden, Chinese, Japanese, among other modern languages. They have the key works by Machado de Assis translated. This is due to the translations into English. In the 50s, we have documentation about that. When Machado's books is released in New York, it's a small one, very good one, called Noonday Press. And then literary agents, I found this documentation, people from Sweden asking about the copyrights to translate it into Swedish. So they don't think about going after someone in Brazil. They go after people in New York to get more information about the copyright of this work and the translation itself. So the internationalization story is this, it's still ongoing. And we are in a big moment now with Flora's production. She's taking these accumulated experience of previous translations and everything that was said about Machado de Assis throughout the time. And it's her translation is totally backed up. It has grounds all the discussions about Machado. As she said, you notice the layers of the text, and you feel the senses that are attributed to this text throughout the time. Overall, in a nutshell, I think this is it. As of the 50s, this process accelerates. People are interacting. Ludmila Nascimentos, Miasso. He said, I think that this multiplicity of studies on Machado de Assis' work that tests the geniality that he has. We see a new look about an old text. Recently, on the press, we had a biography about the young Machado. So if you want to ask questions, you can write them on Q&A, okay? Not on the chat.
Como é que foi?
Flora,
Como é que foi o seu contato com a Penguin?
what was your contact with Penguin? When the publisher found out that you were translating it, they came after you, you went after them. How was it? And I'd like to take this opportunity to ask, when the translation was released, it was published on the press, it was successful. The first editions, they were sold out really quickly. I was wondering if you expected this success after 3 translations having been made, and why did this success happen? Why did you have this reception? Fortunately, I spent years translating Machado de Assis. Nobody came to me. I had, if I had any publishing contact in the middle of the way, it would have disturbed me. I wasn't thinking about packing the text for publishing. I was only dealing with the translation. And after I started this process, because I thought I should have made another chapter for my thesis, because I faced other challenges. What happened was, at the moment that I was finishing my thesis, submitting it, and then I said, okay, now I can go after a publisher. When it was concluded, I had some publishing contacts, more in Brazil, because I had translated several academic books, Brazilian books, and then I tried to think about the publishings that had this profile, as Penguin has this presence in Brazil with the Companhia das Letras partnership. I had the contact of Penguin Classics, someone who would introduce me to them with a summary of the book. And I had a talk with other publishers, but Penguin was quick on the trigger. And they made a wonderful work, advertisement, the publishing interference. I thought that I would have to argue to have a preface. Maybe they didn't want notes. The only consideration was, they said, so the decision to maintain the divisions of the chapter with these spaces, this would make the book bigger and more expensive, longer and more expensive. I thought that it would be worthwhile because they have reasonable prices for Penguin Classics. And the notes, they didn't argue against anything. I cut some notes that I thought it would be making sense only for those who knew these works, and they asked me to write a little bit more. I have the preface, I have my introduction to the novel, and a note about the translation, and a note about the notes and suggestions for the readings. It's the wealth of paratext that they promoted in this edition. It was really, really cool. It's a great gain. I had never seen an edition of Machado with this critical apparatus. And regarding the success that the translation made, it took everyone by surprise. It was a beautiful surprise. Many things. First, we hadn't thought about the advertisement the way it was made. It was supposed to have several events in the US in person, the conventional way of releasing a book. And evidently, in the midst of March, we realized it wouldn't be possible to do this tour. And we thought that it would have less noise because of that, because we wouldn't have an official release at the end of May. A little 2 weeks before the release, we started having big demonstrations about Black Lives Matter regarding George Floyd. It was a moment of national commotion. Thinking about releasing the US specifically, I
momento em que
thought
o Machado vai ficar
this
completamente
is the moment that
ofuscado
Machado is going to be in the dark because it is a
de uma
subtle
ironia fina.
romance.
Não é romance
It has a fine
denúncia
irony. It's not about
tem uma
social
denúncia.
criticism reporting.
É uma coisa,
It
uma
has a
navalha.
kind of reporting
Então,
there, denounced, but it's
Por esses
subtle,
motivos,
whispered.
é muito
So I
provável
thought about
que
all
só
these
a
reasons,
tradução no
and I
mundo,
thought, oh, I'm just
assim, se
putting
tiver
my
alguma,
translation in the world. If there is any
contava com algum
repercussion, I counted on some academic interest. I
contribuição
thought
interessante
that this would be an
mostrando a
interesting
literatura.
academic contribution
Se
because
mais
the
de
universities would be interested in it, but
ter
to get to the point of having
foi
more
um
editions of
fenômeno
it,
que a gente
more.
recebeu com
It was a
espanto
phenomenon that
e
we
alegria.
received with
De
awe
certa
and
forma, ainda
happiness.
não sei
And somehow I don't know how to explain it. This alchemy of
feito inteiramente de uma forma inteiramente digital.
making it of
pode
streaming
falar.
it was launched mostly digitally. We can say that Brás
Viralizou.
Cubas
E
became
vão ter
viral,
fatores,
and we have 1,000 factors
coisas
that
que empurraram, que fizeram
many
aquilo
things that
acontecer.
pushed us
Eu não sei
ahead, that made that happen. I don't know if someday I'll get to a full explanation of it,
ficamos muito
but
felizes.
both myself and Penguin, we were really happy about it.
A Susan Sontag tem ensaio dos anos...
Hélio, there is an essay in 1990s by Susan. She says
contato como Machado de Assis não
she's surprised
não é tão lido.
how Machado de Assis is not
Ele
very read
inclusive
internationally.
Nos outros países da América Latina.
And in other Latin American countries, it's not well known. His work is not well known, according to Susan Sontag. What are the struggles that you see to make popular Machado de Assis internationally? And I link to a question here from with a question from André Galvão. He says, good morning. Is it possible that the repercussion of Machado de Assis' works internationally represents a new wave of his works? I'd like you to talk about the struggles of Machado de Assis abroad that you see, and if you think that there will be a new wave, as André asked. So I think that this has been changing. There is an interest to Machado de Assis translation. It raises a flag showing that things are getting a different path now. Historically, what we see, even in this late entrance of Machado de Assis in the world literature stage and the translations into English, it's an international language, English. And the translations, as they happened, as Flora said, Machado was associated with the academic world, the North American academic world. They read Machado de Assis in Portuguese, Spanish. So Machado de Assis is acknowledged today by an expert group of readers, but the popularity part, historically, it has never been reached. Even the first editions had several editions. I noticed at the sales figures, it's not a very low number, but Machado didn't become a popular writer abroad, and the reasons are hard. We try to reason it. Why, at some point, that brings the interest of people, and some other time it doesn't. In the case of Machado de Assis, for example, first is the language, Portuguese language. It's a language that is widely spoken in the world, but it is a language that is very little read. due to the history of the language, the Portuguese language countries, the audience is the number of readers is very restricted. And people who read Portuguese abroad is very restricted, and Brazilian literature as well. And this literature that came, for example, in the 19th century, Toné and Alencar were translated before Machado. In the 20th century, you have Jorge Amado. They are writers, authors that somehow they deliver an image of Brazil for whoever is interested in Brazil or Latin America that goes in line with the expectations of an international reader, a more popular reader that goes after the Brazilian books, expecting to see something there that confirms somehow the image of the country. In the case of Machado, this is not clear, it's not evident. He's a writer that puts the Brazilian literature in a cosmopolitan environment because of all the reference he makes. I think this is a factor that gave weight to Machado's work. Maybe other writers that don't have the refinement Machado has, but they had an easier international acceptance. Machado wasn't easy for the Brazilian readers. He was a writer. He's not very easy. It's not very easy to engage in it. This is a factor, the language. It's not a typical reading, and the geopolitical part. Brazil, in the concert of nations, it's not by chance that as of the 50s that Machado finds a way out to the international market, post-war moment. His translation in the US has to do with academic audience that knows Portuguese and are interested in Brazil. So this has much to do with geopolitical factors, the emergence of the US as a world power, the interest in Brazil that is included and excluded of this label called Latin America. So we have the cultural repercussions here. So these topics, they are factors that we try to understand, but it's hard to quantify it and give you a full explanation regarding the literal reading, the success. So we don't know. So the translations, generally speaking, is very good. Flora's translation is extraordinary, but people didn't know how exceptional her translation was. There's something there. Maybe Black Lives Matter and association of Machado with the blackness writing. Maybe these gave rise to his work, but it's hard to conclude. Just to add to that.
Não é a primeira edição, mas é uma.
So this is not the first edition. This is one of Williams' translation, one of the first translations, and it's like a Jorge Amado's cover, sands, churches, something more rustic. When Penguin wanted to know what I wanted for the cover, I said, I don't want this. This is Dom Casmurro.
Mas as capas da editora Ática eram meio assim, né?
Ática covers in the 80s, the covers were like that.
Amor, né? Uma coisa
about love stories.
Isso é, sei lá, o amor nos tempos de cólera. Isso
love in cholera times, and people
vão procurando alguma coisa e acham.
They are looking for this, and they come across with Bento Santiago, something dry. There is a countryman playing the guitar. It was published by Oxford. It's a scene as if it was a typical romance, but the story was totally different. Look, Bento Santiago.
Não, é
This
Dom
is
Casmurro.
Kikas
É o Dom
Borg,
Casmurro.
Dom Casmurro.
Não tem nada a ver com o
Leitura
perfil
tem-
aristocrata do Bento Santiago, né?
Yeah, it
coitado,
doesn't
mas-
have anything to do to the real
Quem é a
character.
Capitu? Santiago aí, né?
Who is Capitu? Who is Bento Santiago there?
Como associar isso ao romance, enfim. Então tem
How to
isso,
associate it with her
Exotismo,
romance?
né, de uma certa maneira.
Yes, it's a little bit of exotic to highlight the romance.
Se apresenta.
Flora, eu queria aproveitar o gancho
Flora,
que
I'd like to take this opportunity that you talked about the blackness of Machado de Assis. Harold Bloom said that Machado was a big black writer at the time in Brazil. For the public, for the audience in general, Machado de Assis wasn't seen as a black writer.
já estava
I don't know if you were in Brazil at this time. There was a campaign by Caixa Econômica. There was the actor was white with white beard, such as Santa Claus, but
reivindicação, né?
there was a ring. People held out against it. So this perception, did you have this perception as soon as you started reading Machado de Assis books as a black writer? And the repercussion of the works you said, that maybe you can identify that in this wave of new demonstrations, protests, with the fact of this new identity, the real identity of Machado de Assis as a black writer.
Pensar, assim, eu tenho pensado
I'm trying
nisso.
to think. I've been thinking about it. I don't remember any moment that it was a surprise to me that Machado de Assis wasn't a white person. It wasn't a surprise to me. So
E isso sempre me acompanha.
maybe for Princeton,
But então,
when I started translating it,
que até hoje é propagada,
the confirmation that is propagated that Machado didn't write about slavery, that he ignored the social issues to write about human relations, this is sustainable when you read his work. Romance, for example, as Brás, Cubas. So the narrator is a white man that couldn't care less about slavery. So the level of his awareness when he tries to minimize the suffering of slavery, but the presence of racism, race, trafficking, everything the Brazilian society is present there all the time. It's there, but without highlighting it. It's a loyal and brutal mirror of Brazilian society with these issues. So this awes me that people can read that and somehow naturalize it in a way that people don't notice the criticism that is being done. So in my paradox, my presentation, I try not to get into the identity of Machado and how he saw himself as non-white man. We have only some observations regarding that, how he saw himself, but what he have is the world he built in the books, the way that the characters deal with this topic, and it was contended.
Mas é impressionante como eu
It's
tive
impressive how I had to highlight that in my preface, and there was a criticism that had written about Machado's tales, and they talked about this frustration that Machado didn't talk about slavery. After reading the presentation in my books, once you raise this flag that he's a black man writing about a slavery society, it starts coming out of the pages. But this alert, this raising this flag, it was missing raising this flag.
A tradução, né? Que
I think it was before the translation that you talked about it.
Piauí, né?
So it was published on Piauí magazine.
Assim, exemplo mor da maneira.
So this is the example the biggest example
brutal.
of the elegance, the brutal elegance of Machado de Assis. Brás Cubas is talking about his brother-in-law,
meio que
Utrin,
desaprova casamento do Brás com a sobrinha.
that disapprove the marriage with his niece, and he starts to analyze Coutrin's character. And there is a defense. He's saying that people said that Coutrin was very dry, very harsh. The reduction of the emphasis is where we see the pain, the blood, all the brutality. It's where he's telling things in a natural way. Yeah, we need a little bit of sophistication in the reading, a little dry somehow, but the only thing that they could say is that they would send the slaves to the slave house and blood trickle down. What is calabouço? This slavery, a dungeon, it's something medieval. And I imagined it was something more generic, but you think, oh, it's something underground. Where are they going? Does everybody know about it? Everybody had a dungeon at home. What is that? And
tem uma pesquisa acadêmica muito.
There is an academic research really round, really thoroughly made about the existence of this underground prison in Rio de Janeiro called dungeon that was used for the senhores that couldn't punish their slaves with iron to keep them in prison, several limits in the brutality. But the government had invented this institution that would do that. So you cannot punish your slave almost to death, but we can do it.
Então,
you pay us and we do it for you.
Essa instituição burocrática,
essa bureaucratic institution, this formalization of something that is not understandable regarding cruelty, this belongs to Machado's traits. You remove the brutality from the face of people, you send it to downtown, near Morro do Castelo, that doesn't exist anymore. You take it from the polite living, and the government does this dirty job. And the lords, senhores, they have their hands clean.
Então, tipo, tudo isso eu fui cavando.
And they think that the slaves learned a lesson. So I dug into it deeply, and I went back to the text, and I noticed how this is the point of the tip of the iceberg.
Enfim, esse é exemplo em que realmente acontece.
This is an example that the history context is absent there. He's writing to people who knows about this process, about these dungeons. He knows that people, the lords cannot beat up their slaves, but the government could. This naturality of things that he puts there, this is something that Machado shows us.
As coisas mais terríveis
how the most terrible things that humanity is able to do, and that they are made natural, and it is accepted.
Eu acabei e eu não tinha como resolver.
So I couldn't solve it in the translation. I couldn't break down this naturality because this would break down this naturality.
No meu prefácio.
So I put this in my preface and my note at the end of the book, and I put a D as dungeon in capital letter to show that it wasn't any dungeon, it was something institutional. I put it there so that the reader could notice that during the reading. And there is a question, is Galax A30? So if you can identify it later.
Poderia falar pouco sobre a elaboração.
Professor Hélio, can you talk about the preparation of writer by writers There are 2 volumes. I'm curious to know how did you develop this extensive research and how did you have access about all the information about Machado? I'm enchanted by Rui Barbosa text.
Essa é uma pesquisa, na verdade, que foi feita em vários
It was a research that was done in several files. It was in Casa de Julio Barbosa in Rio. There is a collection of about 30 volumes with the parts of his works. Plínio do Alho, he was a collector of his books, and there we have a kind of follow-up of how Machado was received on the press. We have some clips of newspaper and magazines, about 6,000 items. And working with this material, I've been working with it for a long time. It came to my mind to do something about it, to have these clippings and going after reports, testimonials about writers, what they spoke about Machado throughout the time. With the help of Ida Leverstein, she was in São Paulo, I was in Rio. She did our research together with Brazilian Library and USP, and it resulted in these 2 volumes, research work, living with this material, the idea to put together everything, go after the texts, that the texts weren't readable. And we have 2 volumes, and we have the documentation of the readings of writers who read Machado, the death moment of Machado's, the appraisal and the tributes of people paying tribute to the late one, 100 years of reading, going through the big writers that we've had, Drummond, Graciliano. It's a long list. Jorge Amado, Guimarães Rosa. It's not, we don't have his text there, but we had his view. He had an Exodus view of Machado. It's interesting because above all, it shows the struggle that it is to deal with Machado de Assis. And he is a character that arises curiosity, but he's also a ghost for these other writers. It's a burden on back of everyone who decides to write in Brazil. So the question was by Rita de Cássia Simões Martinelli, this question. Unfortunately, we are getting to the end. I would stay here for 1, 2, 3 hours talking about Machado de Assis for me and for you. I think we talk about him with much passion regarding these special Brazilian writer. And we talked about the process of consecration of Machado de Assis in the new state that Edu talks, writes about his book. So we got into details with Flora about translation processes. Well, there are many questions here, but our time is almost up. I'd like you to have your final considerations. Let's start by Flora.
Mas mais exemplo de como Machado
Well, I'm just one example of how Machado, we cannot get enough of it.
Mas eu adorei a conversa.
I loved having this talk with you today.
Queria agradecer, adorei a conversa.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you. The talk was wonderful. This is not the first time that Flora and I talk in this mode. It's always pleasant to hear, to listen to Flora talking about Machado de Assis. Final consideration, read Machado de Assis. Give yourself this pleasure of reading this writer. This is endless. It's many things: intelligence, sensitiveness, grace, capability of looking in depth, several issues, Brazilian issues, human issues, and aspects. It's a great pleasure and luck that Machado existed.
Queria agradecer também a vocês
I'd
dois.
like
Queria
to
agradecer
thank you, both of you, CBL, for the invitation. For me, it was a great honor to participate here today in this event. It is online, but no problem. I'd like to invite people to continue follow Brazil's agenda in Frankfurt Book Fair tomorrow at 11. The event, the topic will be a partnership between illustrators and writers of children books. So this agenda goes up to Saturday. Thank you very much for your attendance. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are right now. Thank you. Thank you.